Hello, my name is Ken, and on behalf of Hong Kong Life Sciences Society, welcome all of you to this webinar. Thank you, of course, Professor Keiji Fukuda, and also our mentee Trevor for hosting these sessions today. And we have over a rather big group of participants joining this session, including our executive team of the Life Sciences Society, and the chairman of the society is also with us today. Most recently, the UK joined New York and Italy in ordering all non-essential industries to close by enforcing social distancing and limiting the business, school operation. Many governments are hoping to curb the spread of the virus. In Hong Kong, the situation is no better than 3 weeks ago when we decided to run this seminar. We have more daily cases and many more people are now under self-quarantine. Having considered all this situation, I'll pass the time to Trevor before Keiji share with us his overview of the global situation. So please, Trevor, I'll pass the time on to you.
Thank you, Ken. Hello, everyone. I am Trevor, student host of today's webinar. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Hong Kong Life Sciences Society for organizing this webinar. And we are very lucky to have Professor Keiji Fukuda with us today. Professor Fukuda will first explain the earliest and latest development of coronavirus outbreak, the spread and the protective measures. After that, we will have an open Q&A session. Please be reminded to follow the instructions on participation guideline regarding how to ask a question. Remember to click raise hand on the participant panel and keep the icon on. I will introduce your name when it's your turn to ask questions. And now I will pass the time to Professor Fukuda.
Thank you, Trevor, and thanks everybody for joining and taking the time to participate in this webinar. I also want to thank Ken and the Hong Kong Life Sciences Society for initiating this series of webinar discussions. I think it's a really important initiative in this time. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is try to give you an overview and maybe a perspective on how to look at something like COVID. You know, we're clearly going through the kind of global outbreak which no one has experienced before in our lifetime. And the situation is evolving quickly, but I really want to give you a kind of way to think about the event and maybe to take a look at it as it unfolds and as we all participate in it. And much of this perspective reflects my earlier career. I've spent a couple of decades working on events like this, both at the Centers for Disease Control in the US, as well as at WHO in Geneva. And so much of this is really based on experience. So I'm going to put up some slides now. And let me just quickly take you through them, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers, which is really the more interesting part of any talk. So let me see. Okay, we're just ironing out some technical details here. But what I'm going to try to touch upon in the next few minutes is give you some context and then focus on what I think are really the fundamental issues whenever you're confronted by any such event. And then give you a sense of where we are and then point a little bit towards the future, what we should be looking towards. But in terms of history, of course, big outbreaks like we're experiencing are actually not new. I mean, if we go back centuries and we look at things such as bubonic plague or the Black Death, we can see the tremendous impact that it had on the world in the 14th century. Coming up more closely to the 20th century, we can still see that outbreaks of disease like smallpox were killing huge numbers of people. So 300 to 500 million deaths in the 20th century. And then if we go to 1918, the 1918 influenza pandemic is probably considered in modern history, the single most impactful outbreak over a short period of time. And so right now, the estimates are that about 50 million or even more people died within a 1-year period from that one outbreak. And then the outbreak in the most recent time, which has really shaped how we approach infectious diseases as well as medicine, has been HIV/AIDS. And even though we don't hear as much about it as before, as recent as 2018, you can still see the tremendous number of people who have been dying from this ongoing outbreak or infectious disease. Now, more recently, over the last few decades, we've been experiencing a number of very important outbreaks, and some of them have to do with avian influenza, and some of these emerged in Hong Kong. So Hong Kong can be considered the epicenter from some of these modern outbreaks. As well as in 2009, we had a pandemic of influenza, H1N1. And then I think all of you know about SARS. Many of you are too young to actually have lived during it, but it is something which still echoes in Hong Kong as well as in Asia. And then more recent outbreaks of different kinds of coronaviruses, such as the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome virus, or MERS. And then a few years ago, we had a quite severe outbreak of Ebola in West Africa. And then after that, the emergence of another virus called Zika virus. And so currently, the virus or the disease outbreak that we're most focused on has been termed by WHO as COVID-19. Now, every single one of these outbreaks and every outbreak that we experience of emerging infectious diseases has a lot of unique features. But there are also some common features, and I think that this is what I want to focus on a little bit, because it really gives us insight into how we might address the major issues. So if we think of outbreaks really as modern events, if you look at a classic textbook, they'll talk about the spread of disease, but really in modern times, we're talking about events, and it's a mixture of disease and social perturbations, I should say. So if we look on the scientific aspect of these events, in general, they're caused by new viruses. So viruses which we haven't been exposed to before. And typically these have been emerging from animal reservoirs. And so the reservoirs can be quite variable. In terms of influenza, they are usually, the ultimate reservoir is wild birds, but we also have other animals which can harbor animal influenza viruses like swine or pigs. We have seen with HIV, but also viruses like Ebola, primates in Africa have been the primary reservoir. With the Middle East respiratory virus, camels in Saudi Arabia, but also other parts of the Middle East have been the reservoir. And then with SARS and the COVID virus, bats are thought to be the ultimate reservoir, although there have been animals which have played a potentially important role in the amplification of them. So typically these viruses which are circulating in animals begin to adapt genetically to people, and it's through that genetic adaptation that they gain the critical quality which is needed to cause an outbreak in people, which is the ability to transmit from person to person. Now, on the social side, what we see is that invariably, despite all of the experience that we have had over decades and centuries, countries and communities are highly surprised when something starts up. We invariably see confusion and a great deal of anxiety. And then depending on where the virus emerges, depending on what specific countries we're talking about that are responding, the response to them is highly variable. It can range from high confusion to being relatively well organized to deal with the situation, but highly variable. One of the frequent questions which comes up is, what is the role for WHO? And so there's both a leadership and a political role for the organization, but the heart of what WHO does in a global outbreak is really to provide a level of global coordination so that countries can understand what others are doing and how they might contribute. and then they act as an information hub for the world. And so WHO is privy to much information that nobody else is, and they are the sort of repository of that kind of information. Now, over and over again, we see that countries share common vulnerabilities. The most fundamental one is that they're often unprepared. So they don't have the structures, the communications, the procedures to deal with an outbreak situation. We see that leadership can be variable, and frequently public distrust of the administration in any country is the baseline level of trust, and it always puts everyone at a disadvantage. Increasingly in modern times, we have seen that we are swimming in a sea of information. Oftentimes we don't have the right information, so it can be too little, but we've also seen that we now on a daily basis are confronted with a lot of information of variable quality. Some of it is accurate and good, some of it is simply misinformed, and some of it is purposely put out there to create disinformation. Now, over time, over decades, one of the features of these international outbreaks is we have seen that their ability to spread, which has always been there for centuries, has accelerated. So the speed of involvement of countries with COVID is more rapid than what we saw in 2009 with the influenza H1N1 pandemic. Another feature, common vulnerability, is that the systems in countries are weak. We have seen that the countries that do best are countries that actually have relatively strong existing systems and then are able to adapt to an emergency situation. We almost always run into the situation where we don't have enough, and that means that it may be materials, and so I think masks is a good example, but frequently medicines or vaccines, but sometimes it's people. We don't have enough expertise spread around countries, and oftentimes it is know-how. What is the actual experience that people can use to deal with the situation in their own country? The impact and the cost of these outbreaks is tremendous, and it's been growing over time. I think that right now, the cost of the COVID-19 outbreak is incalculable. I think that we are not going to understand the full extent of the economic impact until sometime afterwards, but it is already clear that it is going to be very, very large. And then there are also aspects of outbreaks which are really quite unpalatable. So we see that stigmatism, ostracism, racism often accompanies the emergence of these new infections. Now, having participated in a lot of these different outbreaks, both in the field but also in headquarters, I wanted to give you an idea of what do basically the professionals ask as soon as they understand that something is going on. So if I was sitting in Geneva and we were in the control room, the first questions we would start asking is, what is the actual agent causing the disease? Is it a virus? What kind of virus? And so on. How are individuals getting sick? What are they manifesting? What are the characteristics of the event? And by that, how is the virus being transmitted? How is it being affecting the population? Is it younger people, older people, everybody? These kinds of questions. The scope of the outbreak is important to establish as soon as possible, because if it's small, you begin thinking about the possibility that you can contain it. If it's late and the outbreak is already large, then really you don't have a realistic chance of doing that. And then finally, what are the realistic interventions? So if we're dealing with Ebola, for example, in which it is personal touch and spread through bodily fluids, we have one set of interventions. If we're dealing with something like the COVID-19 situation, where we believe that respiratory droplets is the main way that virus is being spread, then we have a different set of interventions. Now, these are the sort of scientific aspects that we want to focus on when we're responding to an outbreak. But there's a lot of other information or questions that we'll ask ourselves at the same time. simply because we see it in a sea of information. Is the information that we're getting believable? What is really truthful? What is simply conjecture? What is disinformation? We will want to know what assistance is needed. Countries are willing to help each other, but they need to know what is needed. What is the potential for international spread? Once we understand that something has the potential to go beyond borders, the whole issue of border controls, what airplanes should be doing, how transportation may be affected, immediately becomes one of the primary issues. And then, of course, there are economic and societal implications. We don't really consider things about the eventual costs of things, but for example, in some outbreaks in the past, they have involved food sources. And so if it involves food sources, there are immediate implications both for communities depending on the food, but also for trade. And then finally, depending on where these events emerge and how they unfold, there are always some sorts of sociological and political considerations which we have to recognize. So if we look at the current snapshot of events right now, we can see that the outbreak is growing rapidly. These numbers change on a daily basis. The countries in dark are where we have the largest cases. You can see it's now international. And we are having a number of questions which are being posed. And so we're all seeing many, many questions, but I want to focus on what I think are the critical ones. The first one is, how large is the missing pool of cases? Really, what is the scope of the event that we're seeing? We see a lot of speculation, but we don't know. Transmission is really the key to the control. And so who is infectious and when are people infectious? And there's particular attention right now on people who have infections but no symptoms, asymptomatic cases, and then children. And then in terms of what governments have to be thinking about, what societal and individual measures are going to be effective. There are things that you can do for a while, but what are really sustainable? And then very difficult question is, what's the balance between reducing infections in those steps versus minimizing economic impact? And then finally, what is the right balance between political considerations and public health science? It is an unusual situation right now where so many heads of states are the spokesmen for their countries rather than ministers of health. And so we are now operating at the highest level of politics. So in Hong Kong, you can see this is a very nice epidemic curve, which is maintained by the Hong Kong Center for Health Protection. And you can see from the different colors that we have been going through different phases in Hong Kong. And right now we're on the right side of that curve, and you can see that many of the blocks are blue. And so these are travelers coming into the country. And then in yellow and red, these are blocks of local transmission. And so you can see in Hong Kong over the past few months, we initially had travelers coming in largely from mainland China. Then we had a period when much of the transmission or the cases were due to local transmission. And then we're having this wave. And this is really reflecting Hong Kong residents returning to Hong Kong in this time of great uncertainty. And so the reason for why we see these shapes are really important in terms of disease control steps. So if we quickly make some observations about Hong Kong, we have had strong foundations, and basically we have good institutions. We have had a number of decisions which have been taken, and these have been critical for minimizing the cases. The level of media and societal engagement has been quite high. And I think a lot of these things reflect the importance of going through the experience of SARS, but also avian influenza. So overall, I think Hong Kong can get a good report card. The control has been good. And this is a bit remarkable because it takes place in the background of a high level of distrust of the government. And this reflects the societal divisions that we had last year, are experienced and manifested by things such as the healthcare worker strike, much of the commentary from media, and this is mixed and blurred issues. And so I think this has contributed to a sense of societal confusion and ongoing anxiety. But I think on the other side, we all see that there is a want for normalization. So there are more cars on the streets, more people on sidewalks. So last slide. So going forward, how do we look at all of this? One thing that's really critical to understand is that the risk for Hong Kong is partly domestic. That's the internal transmission of cases, but risk has now become internationalized. What happens in Europe, what happens in India, what happens in Africa is going to pose a very great and direct risk for all countries. And so there is an internationalization of risk. The second major point is that there are major vulnerabilities that we have to be aware of. This is the ability of individual countries to cope. So for example, this morning, we saw that India is going to put in place a lockdown of 1.3 billion people. Can it actually do that? Health systems capacity. In Italy, we have seen a large number of people die, partly because of the elderly nature of the people dying, the population, but also because health systems are overwhelmed. In New York, we can see that there is an outcry for the need for more ventilators. And the health system's capacity is an ongoing worry for all countries, and it's an ongoing worry for Hong Kong. The third point is the sustainability of social measures. It's possible to tell people what to do. How long can those measures be kept up? And finally, though, this is not an open-ended scenario. There are many different groups working on vaccines, and the availability of an effective vaccine will be a game changer. So Trevor, let me stop there. I went a little bit over time, but apologies, but thank you.
Yeah, so thank you, Professor Fukuda, for your sharing. So now we'll move on to Q&A session. Once again, remember to click raise hand on the participant panel and keep the icon on. I'll introduce your name when it's your turn to ask questions. So maybe now I will start first. So Professor Fukuda, given the current outbreak in Europe, when do you think the COVID-19 will peak? And will it remain in communities for a long period of time until herd immunity is developed by infecting certain number of people in society, or as you said, through vaccination?
Thanks, Trevor. I think that it's probably useful for everyone to not think about this as when things will peak. I don't think that there's going to be a single peak because we have too many countries and too many regions in the world. Probably the way to think about this is how long is the period of risk of infection going to continue? Because as I mentioned, with air travel and with the movement of people, anyone can go anywhere. And so I think that we need to be looking ahead for a period of several months of risk. I don't think that we are going to control COVID-19 in all countries within weeks or even a few months. I think that the ongoing period of risk is going to continue for several months. And so how are things going to come to an end? Well, in some countries, herd immunity, which is background rates of immunity increasing in populations, could play an important role, but hopefully we will get a vaccine which is available for several billions of people, and that will be the most important way that most people will get protected against the current virus. And so hopefully a lot of this rests on, or a lot of the hopes rest on the development and production and available in quantity of vaccine.
Okay, so moving on, we'll have a question from Alfred Ho. So I have unmuted you now, you can ask.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, Keiji. Thanks for taking your time out and offering us this webinar. I actually have quite a few questions. So let me introduce myself. My name's Alfred, and I'm a PhD student. My supervisor is Leo Poon at the School of Public Health at Hong Kong U, and also Professor Wendy Barkley and Dr. Mike Skinner in Imperial College London. So I just wanted to ask you, I have several questions if you don't mind me asking. So we saw some work published earlier on about in China, they tested this on non-human primates. They infected them, and then these primates then recovered, and then they got re-challenged with the virus, and they found that they had, there was an absence of viremia, and it was pretty good at clearing out the virus. However, we're hearing some reports now in humans that we have some people actually catching the virus and then recovering, and then once they leave the hospital, they get reinfected. I just wanted to make sure, first of all, is it because that they were released too early because they have to make that space, that bed space for another person, and so they actually already had the virus, just really in low amounts, and so when they did the test again, then yeah, they test positive, and not necessarily that they got better and then they got reinfected. Because if the second case is true, then it actually might suggest that the human immune response could be inferior compared to what we saw in non-human primates. So there could be this element of false hope, but then there's also a lot of, I think, facts that have to be established. So I guess I just wanted to ask, what's your take on this point?
Okay, thanks, Trevor, for the, thanks, Alfred, for the question. And probably, I'm guessing Trevor may want to limit questions to different people and so on. So, but let me answer the first question which you asked. Yeah, there have been a number of speculations and people saying that people can get reinfected by the virus, but based, for example, on the information that we've seen in terms of cases in mainland China, I don't think that we see a lot of information to support this, solid information. The chances that people with a functioning immune system are actually getting reinfected a second time within weeks after the first infection is probably very, very low. And so I think that the more likely scenario is that people are either being released before their primary infection has resolved, and so there's still virus being detected, or in some instances it may be that the tests themselves are not being conducted in the right way. But until we see really solid information that someone with a normal immune system can get reinfected soon afterwards, I think that this remains in the area of conjecture and speculation. The one major caveat of that is that, of course, there are many people who have suboptimal immune systems. For example, people who may be treated for cancer, people who may have primary immunological disorders or secondary immunological disorders. And that's a maybe separate group of people. But I think that right now I haven't seen anything which really strongly supports the speculation of reinfection.
Okay, so now we have another question from Jun Tao. So I've unmuted you now, so you can ask the question.
Well, thank you, Keiji, for the sharing. And I'm a PhD candidate from the School of Public Health at the University of Hong Kong. And I remember that in 2018, that was the centenary of the 1918 pandemic. Keiji, you once said that health does not stand alone, but is one part of the larger family of the global priorities that is done by the Sustainable Development Goals. To put it in current context, almost every aspect of human life is more or less impacted by this global coronavirus pandemic. Of course, public attention and resources for health sectors can usually be ensured amid the crisis, but they can possibly evaporated after the crisis subside. So my question is there anything we can do to prevent this from happening over and over again? And this is my question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, June. I think that more than any other event that I can think of in recent times, this really highlights the fact that it doesn't make any sense to be thinking about health in isolation, and that it is one part of a larger group of societal concerns. Again, I mentioned earlier in the talk that we are now listening to presidents and prime ministers talk about the outbreak going on. And I think that this is an important lesson for us to understand, because the ripple effects of the outbreak are being felt in everyday life. People can't go out, people are worried about their pets, the stock market is going up and down, businesses are closed, people are worried about not just medical supplies, but whether they can get water, whether they can get food, and so on. And I think that if we are wise, if we are really wise, we will see that the preparations and the being prepared for this kind of event really requires thinking about health, which is not just in the health sector itself, but is really being done across the whole spectrum of human society. So in essence, we need politicians at high levels, we need the economic engines, we need the private sector to see that they all have a really important role to play. And this outbreak, if it is seen as kind of a one-off or a unique circumstance, we are not going to learn that lesson, to be blunt. But if we are able to open our eyes up and see that some of the modern challenges that we're facing, so for example, I often think of climate change as one of the great modern challenges of our time, that this kind of event, climate change is as much a health event as COVID-19 is. And, we are hopefully going to be able to broaden our thinking, reframe our approach to health. And I think that this is our biggest hope for the future, that more people outside of health, as well as in health, see the importance of their contributions to how we get through this kind of event.
Okay, so now I have another question from Jamila Trindle. So I have unmuted you now, so you can start.
Hi, I'm Jamila Trindle. I'm a researcher with SEG Research here in Hong Kong. My question is about the US and Europe, where we're seeing a really different arc of cases and deaths and response. And I'm just wondering, how do you think those countries, what's the best way to manage the several months period of risk that you talked about? Is there an acceptable level of cases per day? Do they have to get it down to 0? Is there a magic number of tests per million populace that we will need before we have a sense of what the real situation is?
Yeah, thanks, Jamala. I think that it's really hard to think about what's right for each country in terms of strictly in the basis of numbers. There are people who think about it that way, and there is a want for nice, clear standards upon which to aim for. But to give you an example, I don't think it makes sense for anybody to aim for 0 risk. 0 risk is simply impossible to achieve without incurring very high consequences for going after that level of risk. But I think the challenge for Europe and for the US is in essence the challenge for Hong Kong or any other country. When we saw China respond a few months ago, I think everybody was shocked at the level of implementation of things such as lockdowns and quarantine. The lesson for everybody was not that that is the only way to do it. The lesson for everybody was that basic public health measures can work and that they can effectively reduce the number of cases, reduce the spread. But how that is going to be done is going to necessarily have to vary. So even in Asia, if we look at countries which have done relatively well, if we look at South Korea is a good example. They got started on a bad footing, big explosion of cases, but then were able to apply those measures, but in a way different than China, and able to bring it under control. If we look at places like Hong Kong or Taiwan, or if we look at Singapore, we can also see that they've all been places which have been able to manage the situation, but using a different cocktail, emphasizing different steps. So there is no single formula for reducing cases and controlling the situation. The challenge in the United States and in Europe is that these are large regions with quite different cultures depending on where you are, and there is no single political system which controls or which runs each of these large regions. So in the US, you have Washington, but you also have states, you also have cities, and you have a political system in which the decisions are made on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. And then you have cultures which are really quite different. In the middle of the country, how people look at things is not the same as how people look at them on the coast. Same thing as in Europe. It's a region which has been trying to become more coherent in certain ways by the development of the European Union. And yet when you go to the countries, each of those countries is quite different. The culture in Spain is not the same as the culture in France or in Italy or in the UK. And so how you take those basic public health principles and then how you actually implement them is really a very, is the challenge for each country. And so some are struggling a lot with that right now. But I look at it more that way than I do at what is the metric that ought to be applied for each country.
Okay, so the next question will be from Myra Joe.
Hi, Professor Keiji, Fukuda. Thank you so much for your insights. My question, I'm also from the University of Hong Kong. My background is in health promotion. So my question has to do with the infectious period of recovered patients, because there's some talks that there's some talks and reports coming out that some patients remain to be carriers for a short while after they have recovered. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, how strong is this evidence? And is this something to be concerned about from an individual point of view and also on a country level, especially since China begins to ease travel restrictions of outgoing travels? Yeah.
Thanks, Myra. I think that we'll definitely want to document for how long can people shed viruses which are viable. You know, it's one thing to pick up things by using PCR. It's another thing to actually able to isolate virus from people as they, at some period after they've recovered from illness. And that may be known, but it's not so clear to me. But I think the important part of all of this, and the bottom line question is, for what period of time are people infectious? You know, it is one thing to be test positive. It is another thing to be infectious to other people. And in terms of disease control and prevention, that's really the question that we want to have answers to. And so it's true on both ends of the spectrum of illness. Right now, there's a lot of discussion and speculation about how early are people infected. With some people saying that people are infectious days before they become, before they exhibit any symptoms. And then on the flip side, after the symptoms resolve, are people still infectious? And so I think that answering those two questions will be important. But I think what is likely to be true is still the vast majority of infections are associated when people are symptomatic and are most infectious at that period of time. But we will want to better delineate what do the two tails look like.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now we have a question from Andy Toh, but he said his internet connection is not stable, so I will now ask on behalf of him. So he has a question regarding the flattening of the curve of infections. As epidemiologists have different views on how bad infection rate will be in different countries, what are the signs or variables that Professor Fukuda, you will look for in terms of estimating infection rate?
Wait, sorry, Trevor, you broke up for a little bit. Can you repeat the middle part of your question? I didn't quite catch it.
So as epidemiologists have different views on how bad infection rate will be in different countries, what are the signs or variables that Professor Fukuda, you will look for in terms of estimating the infection rate?
You know, I think that infection rates are one of those variables or characteristics which can differ from place to place, you know, depending on what the setting is, what the population is, what the conditions are, the infection rates are going to vary. I think that I'm less focused on infection rates themselves as I am on the overall pattern of cases which emerges in different countries. I mean, to put it for people who are not epidemiologists and so on, I mean, in essence, what we are trying to do right now is to minimize the number of serious cases and deaths during this time when infections are ongoing, and hopefully to get as many people through this period as possible with minimal severe outcomes, so that when vaccination is available, those kinds of means can be used to give you know, protection, to provide some sort of immunologic protection. So again, I'm not so focused on infection rates so much as I am on what the overall pattern and development of cases are in countries.
Okay, so now we'll have the last question. And because Alfred again raises his hand first, so we'll now have the last question from Alfred. So you can speak now.
Hi, Keiji. Yeah, so there's this, if I had known that I could only ask one question, I would have asked this straight away. So I'll jump right into it. So I've been tracking the evolution of this coronavirus, and I've been comparing it to the H1N1 in swine flu pandemic of 2009. And there are some very uncanny similarities at how the virus has been behaving. So for example, with the 2009 swine flu pandemic, you have this prototypic virus and it's establishing all these new clades. It's, you know, going through all this ongoing adaptation, finding out different clades like number 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, and 8. And then you see that after the pandemic, because people tend to forget that the pandemic was 3 waves. It came in 3 waves and it lasted 2 years. And then once it found the right clade, it then branched off, which happens to be number 6 in this case, into 6B, 6B1, 6B1A, and so forth, right? So if we were to just look at this entire timeline and we just zoom into the first 6 months of the swine flu pandemic and looking now at this current pandemic, you do see a lot of similarities. We do see the, you know, ongoing adaptations. We now got the S, V, and G clades. And then if you look on GIS-8, actually, on the receptor binding site, you look actually on the spike protein, there has been a lot of ongoing mutations and it's happening more than once at particular sites. And so with all these changes happening, right, people talk about, you know, there's the theory of, you know, viral quasi-species, you know, and there's also like a base mutation rate for these RNA viruses. So the direction it's heading, do you think that we should stop thinking in terms of a pandemic virus, that eventually it's just, you know, we should start thinking, you know, sort of, you know, be like one step ahead of the curve, you know, to start actually treating this already as a seasonal virus, or at least a semi-seasonal virus? So what I'm trying to say is that eventually when this virus settles down to the normal patterns of transmission that we see for other human respiratory coronaviruses, especially in a population where you have immune and immunologically naive individuals, do you think that it will then, you know, start to, you know, have this, it will start to display a little bit more of these like seasonal dynamics? So yeah, you do get waves similar to the, similar to people normally refer to the flu season. You got your peaks, you know, so this could come in peaks as well. It will come and go. Well, and then when they talk about semi-seasonal, it could be the fact that, you know, it might reemerge again, but not as big as a wave because of all of the social distancing and all those other measures that we're taking. And then you also have this, you know, idea that the entire world, you know, we're separated into different hemispheres, and then we have different climates. So you got temperate regions, or you got the tropics and subtropics where the virus can really recede and then resurge again, you know, at the right time. You know, there's this dynamic equilibrium. It's already entrenched itself into the human population. It's here to stay. It's not going away anytime soon. So what's your take on this ongoing evolution? Like, how similar do you think it is compared to the 2009 swine flu pandemic? Do you also agree that we should also start, treating this as a seasonal virus now? And moving forward, if we're talking about a vaccine, and if you're looking at just how often it's mutating in the spike protein, do we have to worry about the antigenicity? Because we got work from Hong Kong U and the Scripps Institute showing research where they were just taking one antibody, for example, one specific antibody. And so, for example, just because an antibody binds to the spike protein, that doesn't necessarily mean that the virus has been neutralized. So there's the binding and neutralization that people have to be discerning about. And the fact that, we could fall into the trap where if we do have a non-neutralizing antibodies, it could end up quite like with dengue fever, where we then get anti-dependent enhancement of infection, which is something we might need to consider. And do you think also that with this ongoing adaptation that the virus would become less deadly per se, but then with the trade-off for it being slightly more transmissible? Yeah, I just wanted to know, what's your take on all of this?
Alfred, I'm glad you asked such a simple question. So let me try to answer that. Now, I think a way to wade through all of this is that we have you're asking about two related but different phenomena. One, if we focus on the virus, as you know, it's an RNA virus, and the fact that it is splitting into different clades and lineages is not so surprising. I mean, it is an RNA virus like influenza viruses, and so this is what we might expect these viruses to do. And how it evolves in the future, which is going to become the dominant clade or lineage, what the properties of that virus may be. With influenza viruses, we see that different strains, some of them appear to be more pathogenic, others less pathogenic, and so on. I think that's not so particularly predictable right now, but I think that we can expect that different lineages will be more successful in establishing themselves, and some will have somewhat different characteristics than others. And how that will unfold is just, going to be greatly a matter of making sure that we have adequate surveillance, and then, analytic engines like GISAID or other groups are able to monitor and keep on top of those things. So that's one aspect. But how does it then relate to how we treat this? And how we treat this, I think probably a useful way to look at it is right now, we are in a crisis period. So we are in a period where we have a new agent which has emerged. Cases are going up in countries right now, and that's the disease part of it. But the crisis part of it is also that we have now millions, and soon when India institutes its lockdown, billions of people in an abnormal state. And so they'll be locked down, they won't be able to move around. Stock markets are having a very difficult time digesting it. And so we have a crisis aspect to it also. And so I think that eventually we are going to be looking at this very likely as a seasonal phenomenon, and that's something that we will see on a recurrent basis. And in that seasonal aspect of it, it will not be surprising if the virus continues to evolve and vaccine has to evolve with it. But in order to get there, we will have to establish is there seasonality, because then we'll want to know when is the optimal time to administer vaccine, and so on. And is vaccine, which is relevant in one part of the world, going to be relevant for another part of the world? Or like influenza virus, do we have to think about having different formulations for the North or South Hemisphere, and so on? There are a lot of questions like that which lie in the future. But I think that focusing on those questions right now is premature. I think the issues right now is how do we best weather this crisis period? And so in terms of the science, we do need to make sure that the vaccines which will be developed initially are going to be effective in this current period. And then we have to, at the same time, manage those crisis aspects. And then, you know, in a year, year and a half, 2 years, we may then be looking at this more as a seasonal phenomenon. And then we will go into a different set of discussions about do we need to have, for example, a network of laboratories like we do for influenza, which are dedicated to monitoring what this virus is doing, or do perhaps we just increase the portfolio of the existing influenza network to also monitor COVID at the same time? And then how is that information going to be used to update vaccine? And then how are we going to face the control aspects of it? You know, how is that going to inform national disease control aspects? So groups which are focused on vaccine policy, but in addition to vaccines, we'll then be potentially looking at medicine policies. We'll begin looking at whether there is an ongoing need for emphasizing some kind of social distancing in addition to these. You know, all these kinds of issues will come up. But I do think it's premature to look ahead to those issues right now and focus too much attention on them. We should recognize that they're coming, but I do think issue number one is getting through this crisis period.
Okay, so since time is running short now, this will be the end of today's webinar. If you have any more questions, feel free to email us at register@hklss.org, the same email you registered for this webinar. We will compile them all together and help you forward to Professor Fukuda for his advice. Once again, we thank Professor Fukuda for sharing his experiences on COVID-19 with us, and thank you all for joining our webinar today. Before you leave, remember to like our Hong Kong Life Sciences Society Facebook page and follow us on Instagram. Stay tuned with us, and our next webinar will be in April. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.